Have you ever wondered what a pattern 60 years apart looks like when they're supposed to be the same pattern? Great, I'm glad you're here, because that's what we're doing today. Hi, my name is Stephanie Canada. I have been selling patterns online since 2011 and comparing patterns since about 2020, because, you know, panorama. And you have stumbled upon another episode of Vintage versus Reproduction. That's right, I am going to be taking this original 1950s pattern, Butterick 6439, and this pattern from 2011. Now, why am I doing this? Well, do I hate myself? No, not actually. I'm doing this so that you all can learn the differences between the original vintage pattern and its modern reproduction, so that you can make the decision of your own whether or not you would like to attempt either or. I really just want to make sure that when you are shopping for a vintage pattern or a reproduction that you are very clear on what you are getting. If you're looking for a modern line, great, cool, we love it. Buy the modern one. Or do you want the vintage one? Great, cool. It's kind of hard to find sometimes, I'm not gonna lie, especially this one, it's really cute, it's very hard to find. I am here to tell you that if you do not want to take the time or spend the money to source the original vintage pattern, will the modern do in the meantime? So let's chat about the envelopes and the instructions. Most of the time people don't really care. They're different numbers. They sometimes use the same drawings, which in this case they did. But really, the vintage is always gonna give you different information. It doesn't contain things like finished garment measurements, but it does contain things like finished garment lengths. Are the instructions sometimes a little hairy to get through because they have a lot of assumed knowledge as opposed to the modern ones, which are much better at teaching modern audiences how to make the patterns, as they do assume, correctly most times, that a lot of us had one home ec class in the 8th grade, that would be me, and then had very little instruction after that point. These things we know, we're not going to worry about them. What we are going to worry about is the pattern pieces. But of course, before we go into the pattern pieces, we have to actually check these daggone instructions to see, is the seam allowance the same? Because before I get going, we have to see what we're working with. And while I did struggle to find the notation, they do indeed have the same seam allowance. Now in today's pattern, we are going to be working with a modern multi-line pattern, which is going to be sizes 6 through 14. And we're going to be using my vintage size 14. Please don't let these numbers mean anything. They literally don't mean anything. They are all made up. Anyway, rant for another day. We're gonna be using a vintage size 14, which is a bust size 32. So if we look at the two together and we try and get as close as we can in size, we'll be using the size 10 lines on this multi-size pattern to line up with the vintage size 14 as close as we can. There are gonna be some discrepancies because they're not exactly the same sizing, but this we know. So let's look at the pattern pieces. Now I am going to admit that when I was ironing these, I already noticed a little thing. And because it's the skirt pieces, it's fine to start there. So I have got 2 skirt pieces right here, 1 and 2, back and front. The vintage has 2 skirt pieces that you would cut 2 each, so you would have 4 total panels. Boo, I gotta get to it. The modern does not. This has 1 piece, and it says to cut 4. Already a little suspicious. Because, hang on, let me get these out of the way first. Whoa, you sit back there. First up, let's just take a look at the front and the back of the skirt. Well, I will say it's not perfect, but they're pretty stinking close to the same size, angle, all of the above. Now, while I am not normally one to complain about extra floof in a floofy skirted dress, it's just a little different. Yeah, so here's what you have. You got the back and the front stacked on top of one another, and then this thing, this giant thing, that is the modern one. Like I said, I'm not normally one to go against too much, but that might actually be too much skirt. If I line up this top edge, you can sort of see that I'm, you know, woefully short. That's the modern. This is the vintage. Same number of pieces, just wildly different sizes. Now this is not from a time frame where we are trying to save material. This is not the 40s. That's not when this was. This is the 50s, where all of those restrictions, I believe at this point, I will double check my era, but I believe they have all been lifted. So, you're not trying to conserve material, and yet, holy McModern, that's huge. So you go through here, you go on down, and then holy frijoles. The modern one is an inch shorter than the hemline of the vintage one. Yeah. That's what we're looking at here. Now, that's not even talking about grain line. Okay, hang on, let me show you. So these two vintage pieces, like, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, like the front and the back, you probably, actually, I think they are exactly the same. Okay, it's fine. But, so here's the grain line to this one, right? It goes along, is that the center front? Where, where the f is the goddamn front of this? Oh, no, that is definitely the side. So this is upside down, but that's the center front seam here. And then the grain line, so this is the side at this point. This is the side seam. This is your grain line. Let's go to the modern one. Now, just a little different, as always. So, here, hey look, it's the center front seam. Hey look, it's the grain line. So that's not right. That's not right at all. The grain line should be lined up with the hip side of the dress. It should not be lined up with the center front. At least if you're going for the exact reproduction. If you don't care, cool, great, we love that. You do you, boo. So basically this modern one is way more gathered. And I think somebody, when they were trying, if they used this real skirt piece, which I highly doubt, made a huge mistake because you can see here, like it's parallel to this line. Absolutely it is. Is that the center front? No! Center front's over here, my dudes. This is your hip seam. You chose
poorly.
Okay, anyway, moving on. Well, that's not right. So if I line up these two center front points, you can see they have the same seam allowance, okay? All nice and lined up there for us. Yep, And the center front line, lined up with the center front line. Everything is all lined up. Well, that is right around 2 inches. Vintage one is 2 inches taller. Now, is that a modesty thing? Do we really care? Depends on what you're going for. But either way, the modern pattern is much larger on the curve up. And remember, this bust is supposed to be the only measurement that is smaller. The only one on a 10 that's smaller. Yeah. So I don't know what they were doing with this. That's not even remotely close to the same thing. That would absolutely flatten this out and make that much harder to fit, in my opinion. So then we're gonna go out here. We're gonna keep following this handy dandy little line and we're gonna go, what in the ever loving crap is this? So, the 10 line is there. That's the vintage. That's the 10. I don't know. And then this whole curve is just wrong. The whole thing is just wrong. It's just wrong. That's not how that was designed. Is the back any better? I don't know. Let's find out.
A few moments later.
And in other news, the back is just as bad. Yeah, that's right. While they did manage, I will say, to get this closer than the last one, because there's the 10 line, so it's at least only an inch off this time. They stayed with the idea of just messing around with this curved piece to doing whatever they wanted. The vintage is like 2 inches longer and takes a much more rounded curve. And you can see through here that it's a much more straight line. It doesn't curve in like this. Anyway, at least the grain lines match up. So this time around, even though they notated them in different spots, the grain line is actually on the same plane. So at least you're gonna have the correct lay of the bodice, the way that the vintage one will want you to. Moving on to the back piece, which shockingly isn't too bad. Like, it's still bad, but it's not that bad. So if I line up the bottom corners here and the straight line along the back center seam, you can see that the vintage one extends a 1/2 inch beyond. The curves do then kind of match up for just a moment, and it almost is the right angle. until the bottom. Because the bottom just sort of did its own thing. But thankfully the grain lines on this one are similar. So I really do wonder if at this point, if someone from Butterick actually had this pattern and the skirt was just a mistake. Because this is pretty close. It's pretty close. This is not nearly as many liberties as I've seen other Butterick patterns. Walk away dress, I'm looking at you. Got one more piece of the vintage one to lay onto the modern one, and it is the front waist section. Oh my, oh my, oh my. Oh wow, that is very different. So this front, the modern one takes this weird, super sharp curve, goes straight, badoo, to there. The vintage one is still very much larger, all the way down, and then here, you can see where it drops down and goes below. That's where the vintage one is. It's about a ½ inch down. And then it kind of slowly goes back to where it belongs, there where it lines up again. And this one again, the front, the straight of grain, is in fact pretty close. So not too bad. But Stephanie, didn't you say that the last piece was the last piece of the modern one? Why, yes, I sure did. Because we have 2 more pieces in the vintage one than we do in the modern. Now, the modern one made you cut out an entirely other section, whereas the vintage provided you facing pieces. Now, if you prefer facing pieces, you can easily do this yourself by taking your original piece, tracing it out, and then basically just cutting a big ol' hole wherever you don't want extra fabric. So that is how those two compare line for line. And now it's time for Bad Sewing Science with Steph. Well, hello there, and welcome to Bad Sewing Science with Steph. That's a lot of S's. I wanted to come in and really give this project the real try. Also because that footage was definitely shot in January of this year, and it's currently September. So I wanted to come in and give this the old try. Which means that what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go step by step and show you every single little thing, but what I am going to do is I'm going to cut each piece out of the same fabric. I didn't say they were all going to be the same color. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the front cut out of the same fabric, the skirt, etc., as much as is possible. And I'm really going to try and get it on the straightest grain as much as possible because this is a bias cut. And I know not all of their lines matched up now, did it there, Butterick? Let's start. My fingers aren't wide enough with the back. Ah, dear viewer, here is what we call in the wild making a giant mistake. She will realize what she's done in 3, 2, 1. I just cut out the wrong line. This is why I hate new patterns. I want me one line. One. That's it. I just want one friggin' line. I don't want multi-lines because I even looked at the envelope right beforehand and went, yeah, Stephanie, cut out a 10. Because that's the closest in the bust size to the vintage. I want one line. So now I actually have to go tape the stupid thing so that I can cut out the 10. And why am I taping the modern one? Because I don't care about the modern one. Because I know it's hot garbage. And while this little incident was minorly frustrating, it did not deter her from the task at hand. One thing to note is after I laid out both the pieces, I did notice that while they were both bias cut, they were bias cut going opposite directions. And just one more time of laying them on top of one another just to truly realize how ridiculously different they are. And yes, friends, I did my absolute best to be as precise as possible with the straight of grain this go around so that we could get the most accurate results. And with a little bit of sewing and a motivational TikTok live because I didn't want to make the reproduction, here are the results. For me, the most striking thing at first is just how bulky and off-kilter the modern one looks. The vintage one looks much more balanced and structured just because of the way it was sewn. Even in the instructions, I was told to top stitch the midriff along to the bodice front as opposed to seaming the two together and ironing flat, which I was told to do in the modern. And I think that really makes up for a big part of why these look so different. That and the 7,000 years of skirt on the modern one. Truly, I believe that the vintage pattern really does much more justice to the lines and to the way it would hug the body, as opposed to the modern one. I feel like the modern one cut some corners and really started to mess with the bias, especially once they started to change the curve after they had lined up the bias to the original pattern piece. And while you are seeing both of these unhemmed, the drastic difference is really apparent. Because on the vintage one, you should have taken a 2-inch hem, whereas on the modern one, I was told to do a 1/4-inch rolled hem. This would create a drastic change in how the actual skirt is weighted and it moves. And no, I did not install a zipper in either of these dresses. That's what safety pins are for. If you enjoyed this video, I do think you might like this video as well, where I did another vintage versus reproduction, but without the mock-ups. And YouTube thinks that you will like that one right there. Until next time, friends, sew in chaos. Bye. Okay, I can do this. Ha, ha, ha. And my camera's almost dead. Simplest. Butterick. Whatever company this is that's giving me a headache.